Okay, micro frontends using GraphQL and WebComponents. So hello everybody, my name is Philip. I work at Red Hat and I'm in the SmallRye team, and I'm specifically working on SmallRye OpenAPI and SmallRye GraphQL. Both of those is a MicroProfile implementation. And then I'm also responsible to take these extensions to Quarkus. I'm primarily a back-end developer, so today you're going to see some front-end code, but this is from the perspective of a back-end developer. So just know that it's not going to be pretty, but conceptually showing you what can be done. So we're going to start off with micro frontends. The example that we're going to use is a squash management system, a squash club management system, where you can go onto the website and see all the members in the squash club, and a member can join. You can go on and book a court. You can see everybody that plays league, and you can see other clubs that play league, and so on. So the system, the example system, is already using microservices. And as an example, the member service gets data from a Keycloak server, the booking service from a database, and the league service does screen scraping of the Northern Squash Federation. And typically in an environment like this, Conway's law, the teams are structured around this business concern and this service. So there's a team that look after member service and booking and league. And then you have a website team, the team that makes sure that all of this comes together on the website. And that's exactly the problem, is that there's still this boundary between your services and the website. And if your interaction with your client is primarily through your website, your business unit doesn't necessarily see all the benefits that you get from a microservices architecture, because the member service could deploy a new version, and it only gets onto the website once the website team has had a chance to actually put it on the website. So you don't get the benefits immediately. So let's look at a definition of a microservice. And I like this definition from Sam Newman the best, where he defines it as small autonomous services that works together modeled around a business domain. So to explain what a micro frontend is, I'm really going to take this definition of Sam Newman, replace the word services with UI components, and then it basically says a micro frontend is a small autonomous UI component that work together modeled around a business domain. Now, obviously, if you go onto the internet, you can find all sorts of other definitions of what a micro frontend is. Michael Gears wrote this book, Micro Fontends in Action, and also runs this website called microfrontends.org, which goes into much more details and into the principles of what a micro frontend is. The realization that I got that comes from his site is this sentence: the DOM is the API. And for me, this explains what needs to happen, is that previously you build an API, let's say a REST API, and that is what your consumers used. Now your consumer is going to use the DOM. So the DOM becomes the API. So if we look at our architecture, what we want to do is we want to take this line and move it as far as we can towards this side, basically allowing each business team or domain to also have components, or a component or components, which now becomes the API. And that is what your website will consume. So your website becomes a much thinner layer, a much smaller team, because all that they need to do is consume these components and place them on the site. But your team that used to just expose an API now also includes a component. So now if member service makes a change, that change deployment includes the changes that the UI needs. So your user and your business unit see that immediately. So next, let's move on to GraphQL and what GraphQL is. So GraphQL is important in this part here, where the communication between your front end and your service. Now, typically we do that with REST, but you could also do this with GraphQL or gRPC or something else. The nice thing about Micro Frontends is that you don't have to standardize on this. Each team can decide what do they use to communicate between the client and the server. In our example, though, we're going to use GraphQL for all the services and components. So let's quickly look at a comparison between GraphQL and REST. And typically, if you search the internet, you will get some other table that compare the two. The REST is server-driven, meaning that the server defines what the user can ask for and what the user will get. It's structured around endpoints. And typically, these endpoints are mapped to HTTP methods. So your CRUD operations are mapped to HTTP. So a create would be a post and a read would be a get and so on. It's undocumented by itself. So to document your endpoint, you have to add something like OpenAPI. And it's easy to develop. Comparing that to GraphQL, GraphQL is client-driven, meaning that the client can decide what it is that they want. It's structured around a schema and a type system. It has concepts like a query, which is like the read of CRUD, and a mutation, which is everything but the read. And then it also has subscriptions, which allows you to listen to events. It's self-documenting, so by default, your documentation is included. And then the one thing that you will see on the internet that it's hard to develop. And what we want to show today is how MicroProfile GraphQL is making it very easy to develop. For me, the benefits of using GraphQL over REST is it solves the overfetching and underfetching problem, where overfetching is fetching too much data. So your response contains a bunch of data and you actually only want parts of that. And underfetching is that your response didn't have all the data and you have to make subsequent calls to get more data. And the worst is the combination of the two. So let's quickly see if GraphQL is hard. So we're going to jump to code. I've already got 4 servers running. So I've got a member service, I've got a booking service, and I've got the league service. So these are my services, and then I have my website. Now, this is a typical JAX-RS REST endpoint. Nothing special to it. It's under the member endpoint. It produces and consumes JSON. I've added a tag, which is OpenAPI. We inject a backend service, which is our facade on top of Keycloak, where we actually get the data from. And then we can get all the members for a specific club. We can get a specific member in a club by passing the member ID in. We can get all the memberships that a member belongs to, and we can create a member. Right. So to change this to be a MicroProfile GraphQL application, we're basically going to remove all this and say that this is GraphQL API. We're still going to inject the backend service. We're going to say that this will be a query. Right. We don't have to say that this is a path parameter because we're not tightly coupled to HTTP. This is also a query. We don't need path parameters. And this we're actually not going to make a query, because what we want to do is we want to say that if somebody asks for a member, allow them to also add the membership types. So what we'll do here is we'll just say that if the source, meaning what has been asked, is a member, also add membership types. So even though member, the Java type, doesn't contain the field membership types, in GraphQL, that will now be a field. And then, of course, I can also do this mutation that will create one. And roles allowed, as it works with JAX-RS, it will also work with GraphQL. Right, and that's it. I've converted this JAX-RS API to a GraphQL API. And I'm going to show you the difference now in usage. Right, so back here. So if we look at the JAX-RS service, this is Swagger UI. You get it out of the box if you use Quarkus. It's just a way to test your endpoints. You can see all the endpoints that we've just seen in the code. It's there. We can try it out. So let's see if we can get all the members in the Quarkus Squash Club, which is one of our test clubs that we have. And then you can see that's all the members in the club, right? And it returns all the data. So it's quite a lot of data that it streams over the network to get the members. And then I can use the ID of that member to go and see on another endpoint, can I get the membership types? Right, so and this is typically showing the overfetch and underfetching problem where I only want the name, but I had to return all the data of the member, and I also wanted this, so I underfetched, and I also want to see that this member is also a league player and on the committee and so on. So now we can look at how to do this in GraphQL. So similarly, like a Swagger UI, you get GraphQL UI, which is this UI that allows you to do test queries. I can say I want all the members for a club called Quarkus, but now I can say that I want the name back, only the name back. And I can also say, give me the membership types, which is that source field that we added, and I want the name of that. And then I get that back. So if we run through what we've just seen now is in REST, I have to do get me the members. The server will return all the members. The client will have to filter out all the data that they don't want. Then make a call to membership. The server will return the memberships. The client will have to filter all of that out. And then the client will have to take these two, combine them to actually get the data that they want. In GraphQL, I can say, this is what I want, and the server will return that. Right, so much less chatty way to get the data. So next we want to see how we can take that API and move it to web components, because remember, the DOM is the API. So now we're going to look at this part here and see how can we use web components to now create a new API. Before that, let's quickly look at web components. So web components is a meta specification hosted by W3C. It's made up of these four specifications: custom elements, shadow DOM, HTML template, and modules. Now, that allows me, I can use all of this without any library that I have to install. It's plain HTML, plain CSS, plain JavaScript. I just need a browser. Then I can go and create a table like this one, member table, that extends. It's just an HTML table. I then construct it, and I have some callbacks, and in there I can make a call to my GraphQL endpoint or REST endpoint, get the data back, and build the response that I want. I can then define this as a new element called member table. So now my consumers can use this. This is now my API. They can say, show the member table. Right, so now we're going to look at a demo. We have just more than 10 minutes to look at the demo. That should be enough. And what we're going to work up to is this services is going to create a front end that can be aggregated into a web page where the member service will show all the members. There's a league service that shows all the clubs that's playing league, and then the booking system. And the booking system actually shows a component on top of this component that comes from the member service. So let's see how we're going to do that. So we'll start off with the member service. The member API is the one that you've seen that we've modified, right? So this is a GraphQL API where I just have some ways to query membership types and members. Now we're going to see how can we create this component. So the first thing that I want to show is this GraphQL.js, which is just my own exported function where I actually make the call, and I'm just using fetch to do that. Now there's a lot of libraries that you can use that helps with GraphQL requests. I decided to just write my own to keep it simple, right? And let's just do a normal fetch. So if we look at our component now, this is a member table. I extend lit element, which is a library from Google that just makes writing web components easier. As you start building your web components, you'll potentially start using lit HTML, which helps you to write your HTML. And once you have lit you might as well just use lit element. It just makes it easier. You'll see the first thing that you'll see is this properties. So this is my input. So this translates to an attribute on my HTML. So if you think of it as an API, my consumers can pass in the club that they want to see this member table for. And then I can render it. So all that I really do is I build up this query. So if we go to the front end, so this members runs on 1990. This is the query that we want to make, right? And there's the variables that I'm passing in. So all that I'm doing in my code is that I'm building up this query. And then I do the GraphQL request. When the response comes back, I build a plain table, could be a div or something else, where I display the data. So if we look at that quickly, that's members 1. Then you see the members. Now, the important part that I want to show here is if we inspect this, you'll see the example HTML basically said, I want to import this component. It's a module, and this is now my API. I'm using member table and I'm passing in the club. What happens when you use it is the component creates HTML using the templating, and then updates this shadow DOM, which is this encapsulated part, which allows me to put this in this member table, right? The problem with this is that I actually took something away from my consumer. Previously, when my consumer was consuming my GraphQL service, my consumer could specify what fields they want to see. Now they can't. They just get the ones that I've put in the component. So what we want to do next is we want to basically do something like this, where we say, you can say for what club do you want this, but you can also pass in the fields that you're interested in. Right, and this doesn't have to be an attribute called fields. I just did it because that's the easiest way to do it. You can use data attributes, so data dash and the field name, or you can just make it a field name, or you can do child elements. This is just an example. So then in my actual element, it didn't change too much. I basically just say that you can now also pass in fields. I have a default value, so if you didn't pass it in, it will work like the previous example. And now this part becomes a dynamic part as well. And similarly, when I build up the table, I now build it up dynamically based on the fields that's been asked. Right, so now we can say members 2. And now you still see the email, but if I go back to the HTML, I can, for instance, here say birth date, right? And then this change to birth date. So that's also, my user can actually now do it. However, this is fine if I only query leaf nodes, but if I want to say, well, I also want to show the membership types, I need a way to input that as well. So what we can do there is we can say, you can pass in your leaf nodes in fields, and any query that's a more complex query going deeper into the graph, you pass as a child, which again can take input parameters and fields, right? So I can say, give me the names. So then I can say, let's say member 3, then I have the membership type back as well, right? And I can then obviously change this and say, well, I also want the ID back. And I must save that. And then I get the ID back. Now you'll also notice that this is a little bit styled, where I have this lines in the table. And that's just to show that you can also pass your own styling. I'm not very good at styling, hence it's not very pretty, but you can define your style that styles your little component. And you can see here that I've used a variable that defaults to black. And this is important, and I'll show it a bit later where we can use this. The other thing that I've changed in this example is my output. I actually added a part attribute. And that's also important for styling, which I'll show a bit later. So let's look at the other microservice, which is the booking service. So we can look at booking. Now, booking is pretty much the same. If we go here, we want to do a query like this. This is a booking system. It runs on 1991. And we want to basically say, get me today's bookings, so daily bookings for these time slots, get me the start time, and then also the booking. But now I need to name this because I'm asking the bookings for 2 courts. So to do that, we can do something like this. Right. And then if you look at the bookings, it loads the bookings. The problem with this now is that the name here is the username, because when the booking system booked the court, all that it has is the username. So we want to put a component on here where I can give it the username and it translates it to a nice name. So we can do that by the HTML will look exactly the same, but my component now will actually import something from the member system. So this is 1990. You won't use the port, obviously. You'll use a router or a proxy or something. But now I can output another component. So that's called composition, where I add a component on top of the component. And this member text component takes in my username and makes it pretty. So then I can change this to be booking 2. And now it displays it nicely. Right, and then lastly, in the last few minutes, I want to show how we now all bring this all together. So now we have this Quarkus Club website, which I made it a Quarkus application. It doesn't have to be a Quarkus application. There's no source in here. But I have a few HTML and CSS in here. That's actually all that I have in here. So now you can see how it all comes together. So I can, as a website developer, I can say I want to import these 2 basically. Again, you wouldn't use localhost 1990, you'll use a proxy or a router or something. But the point is that I can add these 2 components onto my site now. So if we go to dashboard on 8080, you can see there's my 2 components, like the booking and the names, the member table. So obviously now I want to make it pretty. So then I can go and say, okay, right, now I'm using a style sheet. I'm going to make it pretty. I'm using a framework to structure the HTML better. But the point is I'm still adding these components. And similarly, the member table. And I've actually added a 3rd one, the club table, which comes from the league. Right, so here's my 3 components. And then in the style, you'll notice then that variable name that I've showed earlier, which I can now actually override. So the default black I override, and the part. So I can override specific parts in the output. And that then gives me the page that you've already seen the screenshot for. So what's happening here is that this components come from the booking system, this one comes from the member system, and this one from the league system. And this part here comes from the member system. And I can then change parts of it. So I can say, well, actually, let's make this red as an example. And then the lines become red. And similarly, other parts that you can change. Right, so that is a very quick overview of how we can use web components and GraphQL to create a micro frontend. Let's get back here. We have time for questions now. If we don't get to the questions, then you can also find me either on Twitter at Philip Kruger, or you can send me a mail, or you can also find me. I'm usually on the Zulip channel, the Quarkus Zulip channel. I'm usually on there, and you can find me there. Thank you very much. Okay, so we want to quickly do the questions that's been asked. The first one was around other implementations in the Java frameworks, like, for instance, things like Spring. So MicroProfile GraphQL is the implementations that I know of is SmallRye GraphQL, which is the one that I've worked on. And that's been used by Quarkus, Wildfly, and Open Liberty. And then Helidon has got their own implementation that's been used in Helidon. Spring has got a few other options. One of the options is actually what has influenced the spec, and that's called, I'm going to quickly share my screen. It's called Speaker. So the author of Speaker is also on the work group that defined the MicroProfile specification, and Speaker has got good Spring support. And a lot of the annotations that you've seen is similar in Speaker. But then they also have this one, DGS, which is fairly recently been made available by Netflix, because Netflix uses GraphQL quite a lot, and then they made their framework available. It's not exactly the same as what you've seen, but similar. And then Spring itself has now also introduced GraphQL as a core component. And I just saw a video the other day of Josh Long where he went through this. Again, it's not exactly the same. You have to write the schema by hand. It's not generated like what you've seen here, but definitely some support there. And the other option is to actually try and use small GraphQL. You'll see that it's broken up into modules. So you should be able to use the implementation and build your own module like we've done for CDI on top of Spring. I haven't had a chance to look at that, but that should be possible. So that was the first question. The second one was on issue of GraphQL. Is there an issue of GraphQL injection like SQL injection? I'm not sure if there is, but if there is, I think the issue, like with GraphQL injection, is more on the front-end side than on the back-end side. So from smaller GraphQL's point of view, where we allow you to do this queries over HTTP, by default, you have to do a post, then it's going to be up to you to make sure that there's not stuff being injected and can change things. I'm not sure if there might be a bigger issue that I don't know about. Right, then there's a question, is there a visual designer or a drag and drop type thing? I'm not sure. I'll have to Google it and see if there's something like that. And yeah, that's the questions that I got. Let me just see. In your opinion, is GraphQL API a prerequisite to build a decent micro frontend? No, I don't think so. I think you can build a decent one from a plain REST API. What I wanted to show here is that the benefits that you get from GraphQL can be transferred to the actual component. So you still get that benefits, the ability to ask what you want to see. But if you don't want that, or you don't need that, you can still build a decent micro frontend with just REST or something else, gRPC. Okay, cool. That's the questions that I've seen. I don't know if there's any other questions. I think that's it.